People say the worst moments of your life feel like slow motion. But for me, it started like any other Tuesday: too much work, lukewarm coffee, and an email chain about printer toner that somehow felt life-threatening. Around 2:07 p.m., I remembered I hadn't checked the pet cam I'd set up in the kitchen. Bruno, our golden retriever, had destroyed a couch pillow the week before, and I'd justified the camera to myself as a preventive measure. But really, it was about something else. A gnawing feeling I hadn't wanted to admit even had a shape. When the feed loaded, the kitchen looked normal at first: sunlight slanting through the blinds, Bruno lying lazily by the back door, tail flicking. Then Ashley entered the frame, barefoot, holding 2 wine glasses. One of my old college shirts hung off her like a casual afterthought. The way she moved was easy, familiar, comfortable. That was the first jolt, not her presence, but her demeanor. Then another figure entered behind her. A man. Tall, lean, wearing athletic gear. His face wasn't fully in frame yet, but the sound of his voice came through clearly. I knew that voice. Tyler. Ashley's bootcamp accountability partner, the guy she swore was gay during a conversation I hadn't even been trying to start. I stared at the screen, unblinking. She handed him the glass. They laughed, clinked rims. Bruno barely looked up. It didn't feel like a one-off. There was a rhythm to their interaction that screamed routine. And then, without hesitation, she set her glass down and leaned against the counter. His hands were on her hips before I could even process what I was watching. They kissed. Not the way people kiss when they're experimenting or full of guilt. It was fluid. Experienced. Like muscle memory. She smiled as she pulled away, wiping her lip with the back of her hand, then said something, probably a joke, based on how Tyler grinned and nudged her lightly with his shoulder. They didn't even bother to close the blinds. I felt my pulse slow instead of race. No screaming in my head. No instant reaction. Just a slow freezing. Like my entire system was backing away from the moment so it wouldn't be contaminated by the weight of it. She poured more wine. He sat at the kitchen island. Her hand trailed over his shoulder as she walked past. Bruno stood up for a second, sniffed the air, then flopped back down like this was a regular Tuesday to him too. The recording time in the corner of the screen ticked forward steadily, the only proof that time hadn't actually stopped. I tapped the record button. Not out of vengeance or even clarity. Just instinct. A flicker of control in a moment where I had none. Looking back, that's the detail I remember most, how neat and deliberate everything was. No chaos. No rushing. She even reached into the fridge to pull out grapes. It was that mundane. And that made it worse. My wife of 6 years was cheating on me in our kitchen, in broad daylight, with a man she had brought into our lives under the banner of fitness motivation. All while I was sitting under fluorescent lights 30 minutes away, knee-deep in budget spreadsheets and group Slack threads about parking permits. I didn't close the feed. I watched. I watched until Tyler stood up and stretched like he owned the place, until Ashley stepped into the hallway, presumably toward the bedroom. I watched him follow her. The camera had a blind spot at the living room doorway. They disappeared from frame. I stared at that empty square of sunlight for several minutes, as if maybe they'd walk back in and undo it all. The ache came slowly. Not sharp, not explosive. It felt like a tide creeping up, soaking me inch by inch with something too heavy to name. I stared at my reflection in the blackened phone screen after the feed went still, me, just some guy in a cheap tie, holding a half-empty coffee cup and a secret so loud it echoed. A colleague walked in and asked something about the copier. I nodded. I think I even smiled. Then I got up, walked to the bathroom, and locked myself in a stall. There, in the quiet, I replayed it. Every frame. Every tiny betrayal, the way she moved, the way he laughed, the way Bruno didn't bark. All of it. I didn't cry. I didn't punch the wall. I didn't even feel anger. What I felt was an eerie clarity, like seeing the floor after floodwaters have receded. Things weren't broken. They'd been broken for a long time. I'd just been too naive, or too loyal, to admit it. You tell yourself you'll know. That if the person you trust most ever betrays you, you'll feel it in your bones. But the truth? The real, unvarnished truth. It feels like nothing. It feels like a glass of wine being poured at 2 p.m., a dog resting peacefully on the floor, and a wife slipping quietly into another man's arms, like it's just another part of her Tuesday routine. Back at my desk, I uploaded the footage to a private folder on my cloud drive, encrypted it, and emailed it to myself with the subject line, "For later." Then I stared at the screen in front of me without seeing a word for the next 3 hours. By the time I got in my car that evening, I had already made the decision. Not just about Ashley. About everything. Who I was. Who I'd been. And what I was going to become now that the illusion had shattered. And the most dangerous part of all? I wasn't broken. I was wide awake. The drive home felt longer than usual. Mason took the slow roads on purpose, windows down, letting the chill of the late afternoon cut through the stillness sitting on his chest. The city moved around him with its usual rhythm, brake lights, lawn sprinklers, joggers with earbuds in. Everything looked the same. And that, in its own way, made the fracture inside him feel deeper. When he pulled into the driveway, Ashley's car was already there. Lights on inside. Bruno's silhouette padded across the window like it was any other day. Mason sat in the car a moment longer, gripping the wheel with a stillness that belied the storm building behind his eyes. His phone rested on the passenger seat, the footage already queued up, the volume turned off. Inside, the house smelled of garlic and red sauce. Pasta again. Her fallback comfort meal. She called out from the kitchen, upbeat, casually welcoming him home like nothing had happened, as if the earlier footage was a trick of the light or a misread dream. The audacity of her tone made his teeth press together. She was plating food when he entered the kitchen. 2 glasses of red wine sat sweating gently on the counter, one already partially sipped. She made some quip about his expression, something about him needing to lighten up. Her words fell around him like static, meaningless and far away. Dinner was a stage. She filled the silence with anecdotes from her day, someone's baby shower, an overbearing manager at work, traffic on the way home. She didn't mention the man she'd been entangled with in this same kitchen hours ago. Didn't mention the shirt he was wearing that Mason had once used to fix a leaky sink. Her eyes were bright, her smile easy. Not once did she stumble. It wasn't nerves. It was performance. She reached for her phone, a habitual gesture Mason had seen 100 times, right when she got bored, right when she stopped pretending to listen. But this time, her hand didn't make it to the screen. Mason slid her phone across the table with a calculated, deliberate motion. A quiet invitation. Then he placed his own phone between the salt shaker and the pepper grinder, angled so it faced her directly. The screen lit up. She blinked. Smiled. Then her face fell. It was like watching a house collapse in slow motion, the way her eyes moved, flicked to him, then back to the screen. Tyler's figure appeared, familiar and sharp in 1080p. Ashley in his arms. Their kitchen. Their counter. The footage didn't scream. It whispered. Silently damning. There was no soundtrack, no angry music, no exaggerated gestures. Just the cool, unshakable truth, replaying in perfect clarity. Her wine glass tipped first, sloshing crimson across the table like an accidental confession. Her fork clattered next, landing in a mess of untouched noodles. She didn't speak. Her breath caught somewhere between denial and collapse, eyes frozen to the screen as the video looped, Tyler's hand sliding up her leg, her laugh, her unbothered ease. Mason didn't blink. Didn't look away. His body was still, his breathing even, as if he'd been rehearsing this moment for weeks. Her expression twisted through stages: shock, fear, then something uglier: calculation. As if she were already trying to formulate the next mask, the next spin, the next manipulation. He didn't give her the chance. He stood slowly, unhooked the leash from its spot on the wall, and gave a soft whistle. Bruno padded over immediately, tail wagging, utterly unaware that anything had changed. Mason didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The air in the room was saying everything already. As he walked toward the door, he could feel Ashley's stare on his back, sharp, shaking, desperate. Maybe she expected him to yell. To accuse. To beg. But he didn't owe her that kind of theater. He didn't slam the door. He left it wide open. The sound of his shoes on the porch was the last note in a performance she didn't know she'd been auditioning for. The final scene didn't involve broken plates or dramatic ultimatums. It was quieter than that. More surgical. The kind of silence that cuts deeper than 1,000 arguments. Bruno trotted beside him down the street, the leash slack between them. Mason walked with a calmness he didn't recognize in himself, like someone who'd been burned so cleanly that the pain hadn't even registered yet. The wind rustled the leaves. A neighbor waved. Life continued, indifferent. Behind him, the house remained still, the door ajar, the kitchen bathed in soft evening light. Somewhere inside, Ashley was undoubtedly scrambling, trying to make sense of what she'd just seen, trying to decide which version of herself she needed to be next. But it didn't matter anymore. The mask had dropped. And Mason had seen what lived underneath. The first night away from home, Mason slept on an air mattress wedged between a set of free weights and a dusty punching bag. Derek's garage smelled like rubber, old paint, and bad decisions. But it was clean, quiet, and far from Ashley. That was enough. Derek didn't ask many questions. He took one look at Mason's face and nodded, like a soldier recognizing a fellow combat vet. That unspoken understanding was all Mason needed. He unpacked only what mattered: his laptop, a backup drive, a legal pad, and the one file that contained the footage. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, but he knew it started here. With Derek, with silence, with a plan. Derek owed him. Back in college, Mason had taken the fall for a dorm incident that would have cost Derek his scholarship. Mason had kept quiet, taken probation, and never once brought it up again. Now, when Mason needed him most, Derek opened his garage, his Wi-Fi, and his skills. They began that night. Ashley had always been meticulous with her lies, but her arrogance had left a trail. Venmo usernames barely altered, hotel bookings under burner emails, but with familiar addresses. Derek dug deep, pulling receipts from data archives Ashley probably thought had been deleted. They traced transactions to a hotel in the next city, once in January, again in March, then nearly every other weekend since June. Each booking matched days she claimed to be visiting her sister. The second phone line was the real gem. Registered to Tyler, billed under a corporate discount program, but oddly, shipped directly to Mason's house. Probably stashed somewhere in Ashley's car or gym bag, never once intended for discovery. Derek cross-referenced call logs with known patterns in Mason's calendar and found that whenever Mason traveled for work, the phone's GPS, yes, even that had a breadcrumb, pinged near the house. The data didn't lie. Neither did the timestamps on Ashley's selfies or the 24 transactions for Uber rides that had picked Tyler up just a block from their place. And then came the moment Mason hadn't anticipated. Tyler wasn't just some random fling. He was married. His wife, Kendra, was 8 months pregnant. A Facebook post from 4 weeks ago showed a maternity shoot in a sunflower field. Tyler stood beside Kendra, grinning like a man who had no business being near either a camera or a conscience. Ashley had liked the post. It was too perfectly deranged. Mason stared at the image for a long time, something slow and cold blooming inside his chest. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was something deeper. Something ugly that demanded resolution. He reached out to Kendra. The call lasted over an hour. It was messy, choked with disbelief, gasps, long silences, and the kind of quiet sobbing that twisted in Mason's gut even though none of this was his fault. He kept his voice even, explained what he had, and told her everything with the kind of clarity that comes when you've lost everything else. They didn't make promises. But by the end, Kendra agreed to one thing, a statement. Signed, dated, notarized. With her words and Derek's data, Mason started assembling the framework of what he called the cage. Not just revenge, but consequence. Precision. He hired a lawyer, well-reputed, blunt, expensive. The kind that corporate execs keep on retainer for internal scandals. They didn't waste time. A formal dissolution was drafted within 48 hours, accompanied by a demand for asset forfeiture on the grounds of infidelity, financial deception, and willful identity fraud. Mason included a folder, neatly labeled, containing screenshots of Ashley's credit card application using his personal information, the Venmo transactions, and hotel records. Kendra's statement was the centerpiece. The attorney read through everything in stony silence. When she closed the folder, her only question was about delivery. Mason smiled for the first time in days. She was to be served at brunch. A weekly tradition Ashley never skipped, Eggs Benedict with her parents at a downtown bistro where everyone knew her name. It would be crowded. Mid-conversation. Mid-toast, if the timing worked. Mason didn't want to embarrass her. He wanted her to feel what he had felt, the walls closing in with no warning. That sense of things unraveling while the world kept spinning. The server wore black slacks and a crisp shirt. He delivered the envelope with a practiced calm, set it neatly between her water glass and a small carafe of orange juice. Her smile faded before she even opened it. Her parents glanced down at the document, eyes scanning the bold headline, Petition for Divorce and Asset Reclamation. Ashley went pale. Mason could imagine it clearly, how her hands might have trembled, how she might have laughed nervously at first, trying to bluff through it. But there was no bluffing past the weight of the evidence. No way to explain Tyler's name, or the screenshots, or the note from the pregnant wife of the man she'd been sneaking into their house like a stray cat. She didn't call that day. Not that night, either. When she finally did reach out, Mason didn't answer. He didn't need to. The paperwork had already done the talking. Back in Derek's garage, Mason leaned back in the folding chair they used as a desk seat and watched the cursor blink on his laptop. He felt no joy, no thrill. Only clarity. The game was no longer emotional, it was structural. He had taken every ounce of pain and turned it into something sharp and unshakable. The mask Ashley wore had been ripped away, not with screaming, but with surgical precision. There would be more to come. Mason knew that. Ashley wouldn't go down without a performance. But now she was reacting to him. For once, she was the one left scrambling. And Mason? He wasn't finished. The mediation date came and went like a storm forecast that never arrived. Mason sat in a glass-walled office beside his attorney while the other chair, Ashley's, remained conspicuously empty. The mediator glanced at the clock, cleared his throat, and offered a professionally neutral comment about delays being common in contentious cases. Mason didn't respond. He watched the wall instead, unmoving, as the ticking of a designer clock filled the space between words. Ashley didn't call the lawyer. She didn't reschedule. She called Mason. First it was a short text. Then a voicemail. Then 3 more messages in a row, back to back. Each one sounded like a different person. The first was shaky, contrite, her voice cracking with what she probably wanted to pass as remorse. The second leaned into nostalgia, quoting old phrases from better days. The third was something else entirely, accusatory, sharp, nearly venomous. As if he'd wronged her by not giving her a platform to defend the indefensible. He didn't reply. He didn't even listen to the final 2 voicemails. He simply marked them as read and let them sit there, like dying embers that would never catch flame. The silence was his message. And it echoed louder than any words could. Meanwhile, Tyler had vanished like a coward with a tail between his legs. Kendra, true to her word, filed her own divorce petition and moved back in with her parents. She sent Mason one more thank you email, simple and sincere. He replied only once, letting her know he'd deleted the footage, that he didn't need it anymore. By all appearances, Ashley was imploding. Mason expected her to lash out, but even he underestimated the desperation she'd show. It was a Thursday night. Late. Office mostly empty, floors dark except for the glowing emergency lights and the usual city halo seeping in through the panoramic windows. Mason had stayed behind after a long day, some light paperwork, half avoiding home even though it was his again. He was heading to the elevator when the click of heels behind him made him stop. Ashley stood at the end of the hallway, her coat clutched tightly over a dress she hadn't worn in over a year. Her makeup was a disaster, mascara smeared, lipstick uneven, like she'd applied it in the rearview mirror while crying. In her hand was a familiar object, Bruno's favorite chew toy, the stuffed raccoon he'd carried around since puppyhood. She didn't speak at first. Just stood there, trembling, holding that toy like a flag of surrender. Her eyes, red-rimmed, flicked between Mason and the elevator. Behind her, the floor was silent. The city buzzed quietly below. When she did speak, her voice was low, wrecked, barely audible. She spoke of mistakes. Of moments she wished she could take back. Of love she swore never went away. She didn't plead, not at first. But she edged closer with every word, like a performer begging the crowd for a second act. Mason didn't react. His posture didn't change. His eyes remained locked on hers, but he said nothing. Not a breath of acknowledgement. When she finally came close enough to hand him the toy, her fingers brushing against his, he didn't take it. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a white envelope. Thick, crisp, sealed in his lawyer's emboss. He held it out to her without expression. She looked down at it with confusion, then opened it with trembling hands. As she read, her face shifted again, soft despair giving way to realization, then outrage. The cease and desist was final. Clean. Legal. Binding. It prohibited any contact, calls, texts, emails, appearances at his workplace or residence. There was also a new clause, an addendum crafted by his lawyer the same morning, stating that any violation of the order would result in her immediate forfeiture of all rights to contest the house or pursue shared assets in future proceedings. Mason watched her face fold in slow horror. Her mouth opened, not for words but for a sound, a strangled noise between a sob and a scream. The toy in her hand dropped to the polished floor with a soft thump. She reached out, as if she might grab his arm, or the envelope, or time itself. But Mason stepped back once, a single pace, quiet and firm. The message was clear, she was not welcome here, not in this place, not in his presence, not anymore. Her voice rose then. Not in an articulate way, but wild, furious. Accusations flung like darts, sharp and ungrounded. Her hands shook, her voice cracked, but Mason stood still, untouched by the storm she unleashed. Every word bounced off him like hail against stone. Security was on their way, called quietly by the overnight receptionist 2 floors down who'd recognized Ashley from the initial incident report. Mason didn't need them. He turned to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited in silence as she continued unraveling behind him. He didn't look back when the doors opened. Didn't say a word as he stepped inside. Ashley's sobs echoed in the corridor as the doors slid shut. Back on the ground floor, Mason walked into the cool night air, leaving behind the building, the chaos, and the woman who had once convinced him she was his home. Bruno was waiting in the back seat of his car, tail thumping softly against the upholstery. Mason reached over the seat, picked up the old raccoon toy from the floor where Ashley had once tossed it after an argument, and placed it beside Bruno. Then he drove. Not away. Forward. It had been exactly 1 week since Ashley last showed up in person, and Mason had gone 6 full days without so much as a call. He had started to think maybe the cease and desist had done its job. Maybe, just maybe, she'd gotten the message. But deep down, he knew her silence wasn't surrender, it was the inhale before the final scream. The house was still technically his, though he hadn't returned since the first confrontation. The plan was simple: swing by, grab the last few boxes from the bedroom closet, and go. In and out. Bruno would ride along for the company. But when Mason pulled into the driveway, something felt off. Bruno didn't bark. That alone would have been enough. His dog barked at everything, the mail truck, squirrels, even the wind. The silence hit harder than it should have. Mason left the car running and approached the front door slowly, keys clenched like brass knuckles between his fingers. The door was unlocked. Inside, the lights were on. Ashley was already there. She stood in the living room, tears already streaked down her face, arms shaking from some combination of adrenaline and calculation. Desperation clung to her like perfume. She stood between him and the hallway, like a final gatekeeper, lips trembling and voice hoarse from emotion. Bruno sat nearby, ears down, sensing the tension but too loyal to choose sides. She started speaking, fast, frantic, full of apologies and contradictions. There was no plan in her words, just the unraveling of someone who had finally realized she'd burned the last bridge and still wanted to cross. Mason didn't move. Didn't speak. He just let her talk. For the first time since everything began, he gave her the space she had begged for. But this time, she wasn't the only one listening. A new camera sat nestled among a vase of fake flowers on the bookshelf, a tiny lens hidden in the eye of a decorative bird, connected by Wi-Fi to his Twitch account, usually used for casual streams about dog training. He hadn't titled tonight's session, "Training Tips with Bruno." No hashtags about clickers or treats. Tonight, it read simply, "The truth always comes out." Viewers had trickled in slowly at first. Then the chat picked up speed. Within minutes, the count ticked into the thousands. People started screen recording almost immediately. Ashley went on, thinking she was speaking to a single man, not a sea of strangers. She said she'd made a mistake. She claimed they'd both lost sight of the marriage. She cried, loud, choking sobs that echoed against the hardwood floors. At one point, she admitted things Mason never expected to hear outside a courtroom. The lies. The manipulation. The misuse of his name and finances. Even the fake miscarriage, an emotional smokescreen she'd used once, years ago, to escape the consequences of a lie that was never small. It was all there. Every word broadcasted live, time-stamped and saved forever by 100 digital witnesses. She didn't notice the camera until it was too late. The shift in her posture was immediate. Her eyes darted toward the bookshelf, squinting at something unfamiliar. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a split second, the confident mask she'd worn for years, the one she used to steer arguments and control narratives, cracked completely. Horror bloomed on her face. Mason didn't say anything. He walked calmly across the room, bent down to retrieve Bruno's leash, and clipped it onto the dog's collar. Bruno, tail low but steady, followed obediently. Ashley reached out, not physically, but with her voice, a last, panicked attempt to regain control. But there was no fixing this. No editing. No deleting. No alternate version of reality she could sell to friends, family, or lawyers. As Mason reached the door, he turned back only once. He looked at her, not with hate, not even pity. Just with finality. And then he stepped outside, leaving the door open behind him once again. By the next morning, the video had over 300,000 views. Clips had made it to Twitter, Reddit, TikTok. The audio, shaky and muffled but unmistakable, was shared in relationship forums and podcasts within hours. A local news affiliate ran a segment on digital exposure and domestic deception, using a blurred-out freeze frame of Ashley in mid-breakdown. She had become a case study, a cautionary tale, an anonymous symbol of betrayal in the digital age. Even Tyler wasn't spared. Someone had tagged his gym's Instagram account in a reposted clip, and it didn't take long for sponsors to backpedal, for clients to pull out, and for his neatly curated online fitness persona to collapse in on itself. Mason said nothing publicly. He never gave interviews. Never released a statement. He simply went back to his stream the next week, just him, Bruno, and a modest setup in Derek's guest room. But when he spoke that night, his tone was different. Focused. Calm. The title of the stream read, Betrayal and Bruno, Episode 1. Within 3 weeks, the stream had evolved into a top 50 relationship podcast. Sponsors came knocking. Emails flooded in. People wanted to share their stories, wanted to be heard, wanted to feel less alone. Mason never once said Ashley's name on air. He talked about healing, about gaslighting, about silence as strength. He told listeners that there's a particular kind of peace in letting the truth do the heavy lifting. And when people asked him how he got through it, how he stayed so composed in the face of something so deeply personal, he always ended the same way. In that last moment of the stream, with Bruno sleeping at his feet and the chat filling with hearts and fire emojis, Mason leaned slightly toward the mic. The screen dimmed. The outro music faded in. And then, with a voice like quiet thunder, he left them with one final line. Sometimes revenge isn't screaming into the void. Sometimes it's just pressing record, and letting the truth handle the rest.